Hello and welcome to the Media 7 Summer Editions from Artisan Winery in West Auckland. Our topic today is one of the big jobs, the proper moral job of the media. Should we expect leadership, or does that lead to this?
Respect for law.
That's Will Hayes, the man who wrote the code that ended this sort of muck in Hollywood. And still had TV couples, even the ones who were married to each other in real life, sleeping in separate beds decades later.
Hootman.
Hayes didn't just want to curb strong content, he wanted to morally engineer society. As did, in his own way, the founder of the BBC, Lord Reith, who oversaw the creation of the Beebs' Green Book in the 1930s. What would they all make today of the new Britney Spears video? This shambles on the BBC.
I said some things I didn't have oughta, like I had sex with your granddaughter.
And the episode of Flavour of Love where one of the contestants did a poo on the floor.
She's pooed.
But if we're to take a moral compass from the media, what morality can these men offer? And then there's Charles Keating, who spent his life fighting filth with films like this.
Never in the history of the world have the merchants of obscenity, the teachers of unnatural sex acts, had available to them the modern facilities for disseminating this filth.
But is better known for fraud, racketeering and selling junk bonds to senior citizens. But the fact is, we do expect the media to reinforce contemporary social values. Like, it's great that Shortland Street provides positive role models for gay people, right? Not so much, said viewer Lewis Cross, who complained of seeing,
in rather graphic physical details, the developing of a potential homosexual relationship between two young men.
And the BSA recently upheld his complaint because it believed the scene was too suggestive for the 7 p.m. time slot. Not because it was a gay thing, truly. We're joined to discuss matters arising by two guests who have a wealth of experience in media and communications. Brian Edwards, the broadcaster, author and advisor to a string of Prime Ministers, and Lindsay Freer, who's the spokesperson for the Catholic Church in New Zealand. Welcome to you both. Perhaps we could start with the end of that piece, the controversial scene in Shortland Street that the BSA has knocked back. Do you think it would have been different if it had not been two young men? Or should the BSA be taken at its word then?
Well, yes, because I think it wasn't so much to do with the sexual orientation of the two actors. I think it was really to do with the fact that it was the context of it in that particular time, 7 o'clock slot, when children were watching.
And the BSA actually seemed to be quite glad to have been given the opportunity to set a benchmark, to say that actually, no, there is a standard for programs that go out at 7 o'clock for young viewers.
I don't know, I gather the scene was funny, really. I didn't see it until you've shown it to me just now, because it has a sort of silly ending to it, really. But I guess if you've got someone diving under the blanket in any program and a lot of giggling going on and so on, and it happens to be two guys, it's kind of strange. I think probably my children, when they're younger, might have asked me about that. But, you know, to me the issue is really an issue of harm in all of these things. Is anybody going to be harmed by this? And I can't see that anyone is going to be harmed by this. And this is you know, frequently the case. People get outraged about things, but if you ask, was anybody going to be harmed, it's very hard to identify any harm.
But say someone like Ian Wishart, who I know you're not a great admirer of, would have it that the cast of Shortland Street are the shock troops for the lesbian commie revolution. And I think he's right in a sense in that there is a moral compass in that program. We could not be seen to be publicly funding a program that was mean to gay people, could we? So there are values at work there.
That whole question of institutionalised liberalism is really what, and I often think that the BSA can rationalise itself out of complaints by talking about context always, and of course in this particular case they had it made, because also I think the standards of decency and good taste were brought in by the appellant, but they were sort of subsumed into the children's welfare aspect.
It was interesting that the complainant in this case thought that the fact that it was two young men was a big issue. So the decision wasn't really about what his complaint was about.
Well, people have always been more appalled by male homosexuality than they have been by lesbianism. And I guess it's something to do with what people imagine that male homosexuals do that appalls people. So I'm quite sure there's quite a big difference in how people regard anything that looks like a sexual scene gay men doing something that they imagine in their heads must be absolutely awful. So I guess in terms of public response, there is an issue there for people.
But should we
the
still
only,
be...
the only issue is really the children, isn't it? I mean, that's the only issue here, and I think the BSA was quite right in that the issue here had to do with harm, potential harm to children. But what they seemed to be worried about was that the children were going to ask their parents what was going on. What an awful thing.
Which they could have done with a heterosexual
Well,
couple,
I think that's
course.
a great thing for kids to do, to say, hey, what's that about, Dad? You know?
Now, in the clip about the BBC that we saw before, the BBC was the only voice. We had a similar media environment here. Is it still relevant in this massively diverse media environment that we have now to be thinking about trying to shape national character through the media? Should we give up on that, or should the media still provide moral leadership?
Well, I don't think the media should be doing that at all. I think that's a matter for the community. It seems to me the community should set the standards that it wants and does, and the media will inevitably, regardless of what you do, reflect those standards.
Yeah, uphold them even.
Uphold them even? Well, maybe not. I mean, our standards seem to be so low at the moment in a sense, and I think that the media reflects that. That's got to happen in any commercially driven environment, which is the case with most media. If you want to have high ratings, you're going to have to give people what they want. If you don't give them what they won't watch you.
Now, also in that clip, the BBC was described quite well, I think, as a secular establishment church, which I think is quite telling because it possibly parallels the retreat of the church from everyday moral leadership and ideas. I mean, I presume you two would have quite different views about that.
Yeah, but just on the BBC, though, isn't it interesting that how PC they've become, though, in this issue? That presenters, for example, may not wear a cross around their necks, or a burqa, or a veil, or anything at all, but not even a cross. So much for the sort of the organ of the establishment. It does say, doesn't it, it's giving that message that the established Christianity in the UK has nothing to do with the BBC anymore.
Well, I think there's a tremendous nervousness among the churches generally to be seen to be giving any sort of lesson. Of any sort at all, to be preaching in any sort of form. I would have thought the right thing for the churches to do was to be preaching and telling people what they ought to be doing and not to be doing. And now we have so many atheist clerics now. I mean, the Anglican Church in particular, I think, probably less so your lot, is just full of atheist clerics.
I couldn't possibly comment
who don't know they're atheists, you know.
Yes, however, if the media is going to uphold freedom of expression, freedom of worship, why should they prevent a presenter from wearing a cross or a veil?
Well, they shouldn't.
I mean, I think it's a very fair question.
Yeah, they
and
shouldn't.
I mean, is it our airline? One airline? Is it British Airways? The hostesses, are you allowed to use that word these days? Is it sexist? Are not allowed to wear a cross around their neck.
So how does the church keep itself in the game, though? Because it used to have literally a captive audience. You know, people came in and heard the sermon and went away and were presumably morally corrected. How does it use new media tools? Because I don't really see the churches doing that.
New media tools, or the churches putting all the churches, the church sort of generically,
because they seem
putting
to have dropped out of the
resource.
conversation in the media.
Yeah, well, the churches are establishing their own media, and there is a lot of resource put into new media. So I don't think the church has actually dropped out. I think actually the media has sort of dropped away. But the question I would ask is why? Because the majority of people in this country, what would it be up to around 80%, are people of faith, not Christian necessarily. 60%
I don't believe that
Christian.
for a moment.
Well, you know, there you go. There are the census figures
Those are the
that would
people who say they are people of faith.
Well, they say they are, so it must mean something to them. Otherwise, they would say, I don't have a faith.
I think the best way to keep your relevance in religion is to stick to the old truths, you know. You really want more hellfire and damnation. And it occurs to me that what's happened with the Catholic Church is the one church which has stuck to that most, or with the possible exception of the Islamic faiths, but it's really stuck to that. Once you get into the wishy-washy liberal stuff, people lose interest because they're not getting any guidance of any sort. And so if you're going to use the media, I would be using the media to put forward those old, the grand Old Testament truths about things.
Those moral absolutes,
all
which
of
are
those
not
things,
negotiable.
all of those things.
But if I'm to be honest, I would have to say that my kids have learned more about the moral truths about family from watching The Simpsons.
Well, I think
is that a good situation?
There's a sense in which The Simpsons is quite profoundly Christian in the values that it professes, I think.
Well, except that most of the characters in The Simpsons are absolutely terrible people, completely immoral. I mean, Homer is completely immoral. My favourite in The Simpsons is Mr. Burns, who must be the most immoral person. I mean, The Simpsons is interesting because I don't think The Simpsons is a program for children. I think it's a program for adults, really. It's an adult sitcom. in which we learn the most dreadful things about people. And I agree, certain lessons about morality as well.
It's a pretty cohesive family unit, though, isn't it? Wouldn't you say? I haven't watched it for a long time, but my memory is that it is a fairly together sort of family.
Well, only because of the unbelievable tolerance that Madge has for Homer.
Well, that's...
I mean, Marge has for
that's
Homer.
the human condition, isn't it?
I mean, how long would you live with Homer?
Well, yeah.
Not long. No.
Yeah. Anyway, well, on that note, we'll have to take a break now. We'll be back with more discussion after the break and a dog show.